Hi, everybody. So we're still looking at the second line defenses. I'm going to talk a little bit about the cellular. So I introduced the idea of the leukocytes or white blood cells in the last mini lecture. And today I'm really going to focus in on three of the really important ones, the ones that we'll spend the most time on. It looks like there are four in my list, but monocytes and macrophages are just different times in the stages of this particular type of white blood cell. So I'm going to talk about them structurally and functionally. The big thing that you want to think about, though, is these are the white blood cells that are in charge of phagocytosis, meaning ingesting a foreign molecule or particle or microbe and destroying it. So hopefully you remember a little bit about phagocytosis. We'll get into it in the coming lectures. We'll talk about these three main categories of lymphocytes and then some general features about each one of these. So the neutrophils are the ones that are the most numerous in circulation. So when we think about just our blood circulating, we would expect to find neutrophils throughout our blood. Every part of our body, from the tip of your toes up to your head, the blood would have neutrophils in it. These are ones that have these multi-lobed segmented nucleus, not something that you really need to know, but it makes it easy to recognize them under a microscope. If you have an injury, in general, these would be the first white blood cell that would be recruited or brought to that site. They would be kind of the first responders to injured tissue. They have the ability to release AMPs. Remember, these are those potent antimicrobial peptides that can actually break down the cell membranes of bacteria. And they also have the ability to phagocytize foreign cells and viruses. If we were to see an elevated neutrophil count, this would generally be an indication of an acute bacterial infection. We can also get a low neutrophil count, and that can be problematic, meaning that we're not really able to respond to a bacterial infection very well if we have a low neutrophil count. The monocytes, like I said, monocytes and macrophages are in the same grouping. That's because monocytes are actually what we would find before they've matured into macrophages, but these ones are the largest of the white blood cells. They're agranular. Remember, they don't look like they have brains in them, and they actually look like they have a horseshoe-shaped nuclei under a microscope. These are about 10% of our circulating leukocytes. So if we were to look in the bloodstream, about 10% of the leukocytes or white blood cells would be our monocytes. The levels can increase, though, if we have chronic infections or chronic inflammation, or if you're somebody who suffers from autoimmune disorders or certain cancers, we generally will see an increase of these monocytes. They can migrate out of the circulatory system, so out of the bloodstream and into the tissues. And when they do that, they mature into what are called macrophages. So if you find monocytes, they would be found in the bloodstream. If they are found in the tissues, they will have been matured and become macrophages, which will be the next thing I look at. So macrophages are highly phagocytic, so they'd be found all over in the tissues of your body, and they have the ability to destroy a wide range of pathogens. Some of them are what we call fixed macrophages, meaning that they actually reside in some specific tissues. So they might be found in muscle tissue, or maybe they're found in connective tissue. And then we have some macrophages that are actually just moving through the tissues or roaming in the tissues. They're called wandering macrophages. But again, their whole job is to look for these foreign pathogens and to phagocytize them, basically ingest them and break them down. The last one of our cell groups that I want you to know is the dendritic cells. These ones, again, are highly phagocytic. They're found in most of our body tissues, and they do the same thing, right? They're patrolling the tissues and looking to phagocytize any of these antigens or foreign molecules. This link is not going to work in my little narrated lecture, but you can certainly go to it in my PowerPoints and click on it. It just shows basically phagocytosis in real time, so it's an interesting video. So the last part of this I want to talk about is really cells that we'll get into in chapter 12, but at least do an introduction of them, and that's the lymphocytes. These are our natural killer cells, our B cells, and our T cells. So when we look at the white blood cells that are circulating, about 25% of them are actually these lymphocytes. They contain large nucleuses or nuclei and very limited cytoplasm. There are 3 different kinds. We have our natural killer cells, our B cells, and our T cells. These will come into play in chapter 12, really, especially the T and B cells as that third line of defense or the adaptive immune response. Natural killer cells we find a large amount in our liver, and they are part of the innate protection against viruses, bacteria, parasites, and even tumor cells. The T and B cells fall into that adaptive immunity. They're part of our third line of defense, and we'll talk a lot about them in the next chapter. But remember, they're going to have specificity, meaning that they're specific for one type of pathogen, and they are memory cells. They hold grudges. They can remember them, and that's going to be a key point when we get into chapter 12. So quick checking in, you should know what are the main phagocytic cells that I asked you to learn, and then what are the lymphocytes, that different part, especially the ones that make up the adaptive immune system. If you have any questions, please let me know.